Welcome, curious minds, to Beyond Midnight. If you're new to our journey into the shadowed corners of history and the misunderstood depths of ancient cultures, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what we uncover next. Tonight, we plunge into the heart of a legend, a core pillar of the Viking mystique, the duel. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. Two formidable warriors, clad in mail, axes gleaming under a stormy sky, facing each other on a desolate, windswept field. The air crackles with tension, the fate of honor, land, or even a life hanging in the balance. Swords clash, shields splinter, and one combatant falls, a testament to raw strength and unyielding courage. This is the image burned into our collective consciousness, an epic scene drawn directly from the Sagas, those magnificent narratives of Norse heroes and their legendary exploits. It's a compelling vision, isn't it? A testament to a brutal, yet strangely honorable code of conduct. But what if that vivid, dramatic portrayal, so deeply ingrained in our understanding, is largely a work of fiction? What if the reality of a Viking duel was not a glorious, blood-soaked spectacle, but something far more mundane, more regulated, and ultimately more surprising? Tonight, we're going to dismantle the myth and reconstruct the truth, piece by painstaking piece, revealing that a Viking duel was nothing like the Sagas would have us believe. The Sagas, those incredible literary treasures penned centuries ago, are our primary window into the Viking Age. They are rich tapestries woven with tales of exploration, conquest, intricate family feuds, and of course, personal combat. In these narratives, the duel, or holmgang as it was often known, is frequently depicted as a climactic event, a final, often fatal, showdown between rivals. Think of the epic confrontations described in Egil's saga, where the eponymous hero, a poet and warrior of immense stature, frequently resorts to personal combat to settle disputes, avenge wrongs, or assert his formidable will. These tales paint a picture of a society where a man's honor was his most precious possession, and a challenge to a duel was the ultimate response to insult or injustice. The Sagas describe these encounters with a gripping intensity. The formal challenge, often delivered with sharp, poetic insults, the gathering of witnesses, the selection of weapons, typically the sword, axe, or spear, and the ensuing, often protracted, struggle where skill, strength, and sheer willpower determine the victor. The Sagas tell us of warriors fighting until one drops dead, or is so grievously wounded that they cannot continue, their reputation either soaring to new heights or plummeting into ignominy. These literary masterpieces, crafted primarily in Iceland during the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the historical Viking Age had passed, served multiple purposes. They were entertainment, certainly, captivating audiences with tales of larger-than-life figures. They were also historical records, albeit often embellished and stylized, preserving the memory of ancestors and significant events. And they were moral compasses, exploring themes of fate, free will, honor, and vengeance within a complex social framework. For generations, these sagas have been the bedrock of our understanding of Viking culture, shaping everything from historical fiction to Hollywood blockbusters. They have given us the image of the stoic, battle-hardened Norseman, ready to face any challenge, even to the death, to uphold his word or defend his family. The duel in this context becomes a symbol of ultimate freedom and personal accountability, a dramatic resolution to intractable conflicts. The very word, holmgang, evokes images of a small, isolated island, a neutral ground where the laws of men are suspended, and only the laws of combat apply, culminating in a definitive, often bloody verdict. But here's where the Beyond Midnight lens comes into play. While the sagas are invaluable, they are not unvarnished history. They are narratives shaped by the biases, literary conventions, and retrospective viewpoints of their authors and the societies they lived in. And when we delve into other sources, legal codes, archaeological findings, and the broader social context of the Viking Age, a very different picture of the Viking duel begins to emerge. A picture that suggests the holmgang was less about glorious, fatal combat and more about a highly regulated, almost bureaucratic form of dispute resolution. It was a legal tool, a carefully structured procedure designed not primarily to kill, but to prevent endless blood feuds, to settle property disputes, and to offer an alternative to a nascent, often slow, and sometimes ineffective formal legal system. The sagas, in their quest for drama and heroism, often glossed over these crucial details, transforming a complex social mechanism into a simplified, yet incredibly powerful myth. So let's peel back the layers of myth. The term holmgang literally translates to island walk or island going, referring to the practice of conducting these duels on a small island or a designated isolated patch of ground. This geographical specificity is important. It wasn't just any field. It was a consecrated or isolated space, separating the combatants from the ordinary world and its rules, yet simultaneously subjecting them to a new, stricter set of regulations. This wasn't a spontaneous brawl. It was a formal procedure, a last resort in a society that, despite its reputation for violence, also valued order and the resolution of conflict. The sagas might lead you to believe that a holmgang was almost always a fight to the death. The hero, challenged by a villain, triumphs in a bloody spectacle, securing his honor and often a great deal of wealth or land. But historical research, particularly into the early Icelandic and Norwegian law codes, reveals a starkly different reality. These legal texts, such as the Sagas Grey Goose laws from Iceland, contain detailed provisions for holmgang and einvigi, a more general term for single combat. And what they describe is a process riddled with rules, limitations, and most surprisingly, a strong emphasis on non-lethal outcomes. Imagine, if you will, a Viking society grappling with the perennial problem of justice. Blood feuds, while sometimes glorified in sagas, were incredibly destabilizing. They could decimate families, drain resources, and plunge entire communities into cycles of retaliatory violence. Formal legal courts, or things, were developing, but they were often slow, required considerable travel, and their judgments could be difficult to enforce without the backing of powerful Gathar chieftains. In this context, holmgang emerged as a pragmatic, albeit dramatic, alternative. It offered a swift, decisive, and public resolution to disputes that might otherwise fester or escalate into wider conflict. The primary purpose of a holmgang, in many instances, was not to kill an opponent, but to prove one's right or might, often through a demonstration of superior skill or endurance, leading to the opponent's submission, injury, or withdrawal. The stakes were high, certainly, but the ultimate goal was often a legal or social settlement, not necessarily a fatality. This is a crucial distinction that the sagas, in their pursuit of narrative impact, frequently overlook. They transform a legal mechanism into a romanticized death match, thereby distorting our understanding of its true function in Viking society. Let's delve deeper into the legal framework that governed these duels. The Sagas and other legal sources lay out surprisingly specific rules. For instance, there were often restrictions on the types of weapons that could be used, or at least an agreement had to be reached beforehand. It wasn't always a free-for-all with whatever weapon a warrior happened to possess. Sometimes, specific swords were designated, or the combatants might even be limited to shields and blunted weapons, or even just wrestling. This immediately challenges the saga image of two heavily armed warriors clashing with deadly intent. If the goal was simply to establish superiority, a demonstration of skill with less lethal means could suffice. Furthermore, the home itself was often marked out with specific boundaries. Combatants were not allowed to step outside these boundaries, and doing so could result in a forfeiture of the duel. This wasn't just a matter of fair play. It was about containing the conflict, preventing it from spilling over into the wider community. The holmgang was a contained event, a ritualized performance of justice, not an uncontrolled outburst of violence. There were often witnesses present, not just for the spectacle, but to ensure that the rules were followed and that the outcome was legitimately observed. These witnesses would later testify to the outcome, lending it legal weight. Perhaps the most startling revelation, contrary to saga portrayals, is the common practice of ending a holmgang at first blood. Yes, you heard that correctly. Many duels were designed to conclude as soon as one combatant sustained a wound, even a minor one. The shedding of blood, rather than the taking of a life, was often sufficient to determine the victor and resolve the dispute. The injured party would then be deemed the loser and would have to concede the point of contention, whether it was land, property, or an accusation of wrongdoing. This practice dramatically shifts our perception of the holmgang from a death match to a trial by ordeal, where the ability to withstand injury or to inflict the first wound was the decisive factor. It speaks to a society that understood the value of human life, even in a culture often characterized by its martial prowess. Killing, even in a duel, was not a trivial matter and could have significant repercussions, including the payment of wergild man price to the deceased's family or even further legal entanglements. Consider the implications of a first blood rule. It transforms the duel from an endurance contest into a test of precision, speed, and defensive skill. A warrior might be incredibly strong, but if they are easily wounded, they would lose. This also suggests that the purpose was not necessarily to eliminate an opponent, but to humiliate them, force their submission, or simply prove a point. The loss of face, the admission of defeat, was often a more potent outcome than death itself, especially in a society where honor and reputation were paramount. A living, defeated opponent could still suffer the social consequences of their loss, serving as a cautionary tale, whereas a dead opponent might simply become a martyr or a source of further vengeance. The sagas, however, rarely dwell on these nuances. They prefer the dramatic flourish of a fatal blow, the hero's ultimate triumph over a fallen foe. This is understandable from a narrative perspective. A story where a duel ends with a small cut to the arm and a subsequent legal settlement is far less exciting than one where heads roll. But it is precisely this narrative preference that has led to our skewed understanding of the historical reality. The sagas are not legal documents. They are works of art, designed to entertain and inspire, and often to reinforce certain heroic ideals. Furthermore, the idea of a duel to the death implies that the losing party has no option but to perish. Yet, historical sources suggest that retreat or surrender was a very real, albeit often shameful, option. If a combatant realized they were outmatched, they could concede the fight, accepting the loss of the dispute and the accompanying social stigma, but preserving their life. This again highlights the pragmatic nature of the holmgang. It was a mechanism for conflict resolution, not a mandatory suicide pact. The shame of surrender might be profound, but it was arguably preferable to death, especially if the dispute was over something less than life or death stakes, such as a boundary line or a stolen animal. The very concept of the holmgang itself varied across different regions and time periods within the Viking Age. While often associated with Scandinavia and Iceland, similar forms of judicial combat existed in various cultures. The specifics, however, were locally adapted. In some areas, the duel might be more about wrestling or unarmed combat, while in others, it involved specific weapons. The common thread, though, was its function as a formal, ritualized process, often overseen by witnesses or legal authorities, designed to provide a definitive resolution to a dispute. It was a tool within a developing legal system, not an anarchic free-for-all. Let's consider the economic and social underpinnings of these duels, an aspect almost entirely absent from the romanticized saga narratives. Many holmgangs were not about avenging a personal slight or a family murder, but about mundane, yet incredibly important, property disputes. Land ownership, inheritance, disputed debts, and claims over livestock were frequent causes for challenge. In a society without extensive written records or a robust, centralized legal bureaucracy, The holmgang offered a tangible, physical way to prove one's claim. If you could defeat your opponent in a duel, you effectively proved your right to the disputed property. This wasn't just about honor. It was about tangible assets, about survival and prosperity in a challenging environment. Imagine a scenario. Two farmers dispute the boundary between their fields. Verbal arguments escalate, neither willing to concede. The local thing assembly might be too far, too slow, or too divided in its loyalties to offer a swift resolution. A holmgang could be proposed. The two farmers, perhaps not seasoned warriors, but men of their community, would agree to meet. The rules would be set, perhaps a specific type of staff, or even just wrestling within a marked circle. The first to be forced out of the circle, or to yield, would lose the claim to the disputed land. This is a far cry from the image of a berserker raging with an axe, isn't it? It transforms the duel into a form of physical arbitration, a trial by ordeal where physical prowess, or even just sheer stubbornness, could determine legal ownership. Debt collection was another surprisingly common catalyst for duels. If a man owed another a sum of money or goods and refused to pay, a challenge could be issued. The duel then became a test of who was in the right or who had the stronger claim. The loser would be obligated to pay the debt, often with additional penalties for having forced the duel. This highlights the holmgang as a mechanism for enforcing contracts and obligations in a society where formal enforcement might be difficult. It was a way to bypass the often cumbersome legal process and force a resolution. Even criminal accusations could lead to a holmgang. If a man was accused of theft, assault, or other serious crimes and denied the accusation, he might challenge his accuser to a duel to prove his innocence. This was a form of oath-taking by combat, where the gods or fate were believed to favor the righteous. If the accused won, his name was cleared. If he lost, his guilt was established, and he would face the consequences, which could include outlawry or the payment of wergild. This functioned as a judicial process, a means of determining guilt or innocence, is a far cry from the purely personal, vengeance-driven duels often depicted in sagas. The role of the gothi, the chieftain or local leader, was often crucial in these proceedings. While not always directly involved in the fighting, the gothi would often oversee the duel, ensuring that the rules were followed, that witnesses were present, and that the outcome was accepted by both parties and the community. Their authority lent legitimacy to the process. In some cases, the gothi might even act as an arbiter, trying to negotiate a settlement before the duel, or interpreting the outcome afterwards. This again underscores the holmgang as a structured legal event, not an unregulated bloodbath. The sagas, in their vivid storytelling, often focus on the exceptional rather than the mundane. They highlight the most dramatic, the most heroic, and often the most violent encounters because these make for better stories. They are less interested in the nuances of legal procedure or the pragmatic resolution of property disputes. This is not to say that fatal duels never occurred. They certainly did. But they were likely the exception, not the rule, and their dramatic retelling in the sagas elevated them to a status that misrepresents their overall frequency and purpose in Viking society. The sagas are, in essence, the highlight reel of Viking life, showcasing the most spectacular moments, often at the expense of everyday reality. Consider the psychological aspect. The very threat of a holmgang could be a powerful deterrent or a strong motivator for settlement. Knowing that a dispute could escalate to personal combat, even if non-lethal, would encourage parties to negotiate, to find common ground, and to avoid the public humiliation of a defeat or the potential for injury. The holmgang, therefore, functioned not just as a resolution mechanism, but also as a pressure valve, encouraging preemptive diplomacy. It was a tool within a complex social system designed to maintain a fragile peace, not simply to unleash violence. The sagas also often depict duels as highly personal affairs, driven by deep-seated animosities or profound insults. While these certainly happened, the legal codes suggest that many challenges were more formal, almost ritualistic, ways of asserting acclaim or demanding satisfaction within a recognized framework. The personal animosity might be present, but the homegang provided a structured outlet for it, preventing it from spiraling into uncontrolled feuds that could engulf entire families or communities. The romanticized image of the duel also often overlooks the very real dangers and practicalities of combat. Even a first-blood duel could result in serious injury, infection, or long-term disability in an age without modern medicine. Losing an eye, a hand, or suffering a debilitating wound could effectively end a man's ability to farm, fight, or provide for his family. The stakes were always high, regardless of whether the duel was intended to be fatal. This practical reality would have weighed heavily on anyone considering a challenge or accepting one. The sagas rarely delve into the mundane aftermath of a non-fatal duel, the painful recovery, the medical care, or lack thereof, the potential for permanent impairment. They prefer the clean, decisive victory or defeat. Let's turn our attention to the saga's exaggerations and their purpose. As mentioned, these were written down centuries after the events they describe, often by Christian scribes in Iceland. This temporal and cultural distance is critical. The oral traditions that fed into the written sagas would have naturally evolved, becoming grander and more dramatic with each retelling. Storytellers, by their very nature, embellish. They heighten the stakes, exaggerate the prowess of heroes, and make villains more formidable to enhance the narrative's impact. The entertainment value of these stories cannot be overstated. Imagine a long winter's night in a communal hall and a skilled storyteller recounting the epic deeds of ancestors. A tale of a regulated legal dispute ending in a minor cut is hardly going to captivate an audience in the same way as a description of a warrior cleaving his foe in two. The sagas were designed to be gripping, to evoke strong emotions, and to provide thrilling entertainment. The glorification of combat, the emphasis on heroic bravery, and the dramatic, often fatal, outcomes of duels served this purpose perfectly. They were the action movies of their day. Beyond mere entertainment, the sagas also served as a means of preserving cultural memory and reinforcing societal values. They presented heroic archetypes, the brave warrior, the cunning leader, the honorable man, and showed how these ideals were upheld, often through personal combat. The duel, even if exaggerated, became a powerful symbol of a man's commitment to his honor, his family, and his word. It taught moral lessons, albeit often brutal ones, about the consequences of insult, injustice, and cowardice. The sagas were not historical treatises in the modern sense. They were moral and cultural guides, using historical figures and events as a backdrop for timeless themes. The influence of later Christianization also needs to be considered. When the sagas were finally committed to parchment, Iceland had been Christian for centuries. While the sagas celebrated pagan heroes and their values, the scribes themselves lived in a Christian world. This might have subtly influenced how they portrayed pagan violence. Some scholars suggest that the emphasis on fatal outcomes in duels, or the overall brutality of pagan society, might have been subtly amplified by Christian authors to highlight the savagery of the pre-Christian era, or to create a dramatic contrast with the civilizing influence of Christianity. This is not to say it was a deliberate distortion, but rather an unconscious shaping of the narrative through a different cultural lens. The idea of a duel to the death might have resonated with later medieval Christian concepts of trial by combat, but applied retrospectively to a different cultural context. So when we read about a saga hero engaging in a homegang where the outcome is inevitably death for one party, we must read it with a critical eye. We must recognize that we are encountering a literary device, a narrative choice, rather than a direct, unembellished historical account. The sagas are magnificent, but they are not textbooks. They are epic poems in prose form, and like all epic poems, they prioritize drama and heroism over forensic accuracy. They give us a powerful sense of the Viking world, but not necessarily a precise record of its every custom. Now let's consider what archaeology can tell us about this. When we dig into the ground, what evidence do we find that speaks to the reality of Viking duels? This is where the limitations of archaeology become apparent. We find weapons, certainly. Swords, axes, spears, and shields are common grave goods and battlefield finds. These tell us about the tools of war and personal defense. We find evidence of violence on human remains, cut marks on bones, healed fractures, signs of trauma. These confirm that Viking society was indeed violent and that combat was a part of life. However, archaeology struggles to differentiate between a weapon used in a duel, a skirmish, a raid, or a full-scale battle. There is no unique dual sword or homegang axe that stands out in the archaeological record. We don't find specific sites that are unambiguously identified as dual grounds with unique features that distinguish them from other areas of human activity. The home itself, an island or a designated space, would likely leave little to no archaeological trace that would specifically confirm its use for duels, beyond perhaps the general presence of human activity or a few scattered artifacts. What archaeology does show us is a society where weapons were highly valued, often intricately decorated, and sometimes passed down through generations. This suggests that the ability to wield a weapon and to defend oneself was an important aspect of male identity, but it doesn't tell us the specific context in which these weapons were used for personal combat to resolve disputes. The absence of specific archaeological evidence for the first blood rule or for the strict boundaries of a homegang doesn't mean these practices didn't exist. It simply means that such nuances are incredibly difficult to detect in the material record. Archaeology provides the stage and some of the props, but the script, the rules of the drama, largely come from textual sources. And as we've seen, those textual sources, particularly the sagas, need careful interpretation. The evolution and eventual decline of dueling practices like the homegang further illustrate its nature as a legal and social mechanism. As Viking societies developed more sophisticated and centralized legal systems, the need for personal combat as a means of dispute resolution gradually diminished. The Thing's assemblies became more powerful, their judgments more consistently enforced, and their reach more extensive. Why resort to a potentially dangerous duel when a formal court could provide a safer, more predictable, and equally binding resolution? Christianization also played a significant role. With the adoption of Christianity, new moral and legal frameworks emerged. The Church generally condemned personal combat as a means of settling disputes, advocating instead for judicial processes, arbitration, and divine judgment through nonviolent means. While trial by combat did exist in medieval Christian Europe, it was often distinct from the pagan homegang and developed within a different theological and legal context. The Church's influence pushed societies away from such pagan practices, viewing them as barbaric or unchristian. In places like Iceland, where the legal codes are particularly well preserved, we can track the eventual outlawing of homegang. Initially, the laws regulated it, placing increasing restrictions on its use. Then, around the early 11th century, homegang was officially abolished in Iceland. This wasn't a sudden, arbitrary decision, but the culmination of a gradual shift in legal thinking and social norms. The practice was seen as disruptive, dangerous, and increasingly incompatible with the developing legal and moral landscape. It had served its purpose, but society had moved on, finding more civilized ways to resolve conflict. The fact that it was outlawed suggests that it was indeed a formal, recognized practice, not just an occasional, spontaneous brawl. To illustrate these points, let's construct a hypothetical scenario, one that blends the insights from legal codes with the storytelling flair of the sagas, but with a grounded sense of reality. Imagine two men, Thorgest and Bjorn, living in a small settlement in 10th century Norway. Thorgest claims that Bjorn's cattle have repeatedly grazed on his land, damaging his crops. Bjorn denies this, asserting that his cattle have always remained within his own pasture. The dispute festers, leading to angry words and threats. Neither man is willing to back down, and the local thing is not due to meet for several months. Thorgest, feeling his honor slighted and his livelihood threatened, formally challenges Bjorn to a holmgang. He delivers the challenge publicly, perhaps at a small gathering, declaring that Bjorn is a liar and a thief of his harvest. Bjorn, equally proud, cannot refuse without losing face entirely. They agree to meet on a small, rocky islet in the nearby fjord, a traditional spot for such matters, 3 days hence. Crucially, they do not simply grab their deadliest weapons. Instead, guided by custom and the presence of a local elder who will act as a witness, they agree to the terms. They will use their round shields and short axes, but the axes will be blunted, or they will fight only until one man is disarmed or yields. Let's assume, for this instance, they agree to the first blood rule. If either man draws blood from the other, the duel is over, and the one who bled first loses the dispute. The day arrives. A small crowd gathers on the mainland shore, watching as Thorgest and Bjorn are rowed out to the islet. The elder marks a circular area on the rocky ground with a staff, declaring it the boundary. The two men strip down to their tunics, leaving their heavier mail shirts behind, as is often the custom for such regulated duels, to emphasize skill over brute protection. They stand opposite each other, shields raised. The fight begins. It's not a wild berserker charge. Both men are cautious, circling, testing each other's defenses. Thorgest, younger and quicker, tries to feint, aiming for Bjorn's exposed leg. Bjorn, older and more experienced, parries with his shield, deflecting the blow. The clash of blunted steel on wood echoes across the water. The fight is intense, demanding stamina and focus, but it lacks the murderous intent often described in the sagas. Neither man is trying to kill the other, but both are desperate to win. Suddenly, Thorgest sees an opening. As Bjorn shifts his weight, Thorgest lunges, his blunted axe scraping across Bjorn's arm. It's a shallow cut, just enough to break the skin, a thin line of red appearing on Bjorn's forearm. "Blood," shouts the elder, stepping forward and striking his staff on the ground. First blood has been drawn, the duel is concluded. Bjorn, panting and grimacing, looks at the wound. He knows the rules. He has lost. He lowers his shield, defeated. Thorgest, equally exhausted, stands victorious, his chest heaving. The outcome is clear. Thorgest has won the dispute. Bjorn must now acknowledge Thorgest's claim to the land and perhaps pay a small compensation for the damaged crops and for forcing the duel. There is no death, no glorious slaying, just a legal resolution arrived at through a regulated trial by combat. Bjorn carries the shame of defeat and a minor wound, but he lives to farm another day. Thorgest's honor is restored, and his land claims secured. This hypothetical scenario, while still dramatic, is far more aligned with the legal and historical understanding of holmgang than the saga portrayals. It highlights the formality, the rules, the non-lethal intent, and the ultimate purpose of dispute resolution. It underscores that Viking society, despite its reputation, was not a lawless free-for-all, but a complex system with various mechanisms for maintaining order and justice. The sagas, therefore, present us with a curated, dramatized version of reality. They are not merely historical records, but powerful narratives crafted to entertain, to teach, and to immortalize heroes. In their hands, the holmgang transforms from a legal procedure into an epic clash of titans, a test of ultimate courage and skill where only one can emerge alive. This transformation, while making for compelling storytelling, has inadvertently obscured the true nature of these duels for centuries. When we consider the broader scope of Viking life, it becomes clear that such strict adherence to deadly combat for every grievance would have been socially unsustainable. A society where every dispute led to a fatal duel would quickly deplete its male population, especially its most capable warriors, who would be called upon most often. The pragmatic reality of maintaining a functioning community, raising families, farming land, and embarking on long-distance voyages necessitated systems of conflict resolution that were not always fatal. The preservation of life, even the life of an opponent, was often more beneficial to the community than their death, especially if that opponent could be made to pay compensation or yield a valuable resource. The holmgang, in its true historical context, was a fascinating blend of ritual, and the ritual takes form as a complex blend of law, tradition, and social expectation. As we have already seen, the holmgang was not merely a duel in the narrow sense, but rather a carefully regulated institution that mediated conflict in Viking society. It served a dual function. On one hand, it was a stage for physical prowess, courage, and reputation. On the other, it was a judicial mechanism, one that provided a controlled framework for the resolution of disputes that might otherwise spiral into endless cycles of vengeance. To perceive the holmgang only as violence is therefore to miss its deeper social logic. It was an instrument of order, not chaos. The socioeconomic role of holmgang. The Viking world, though often romanticized as a realm of warriors and raiders, was first and foremost agrarian. Fields, livestock, and arable land were the foundation of wealth and survival. Property was not simply an economic resource, but a measure of honor, lineage, and social standing. Thus, disputes over land, inheritance, or contracts were never merely private matters. They resonated across kin groups and communities. Here, the holmgang assumed its pragmatic role. By permitting claimants to test their rights within a circumscribed arena, society sought to prevent blood feuds that could devastate entire lineages. It was, paradoxically, a system designed to limit violence by concentrating it, ritualizing it, and resolving it within a single, sanctioned act. In this way, Viking law reveals a subtle balance. It acknowledged the inevitability of conflict, yet sought to domesticate it within ritual boundaries. Ritual spectacle and the public gaze. The holmgang was never a private affair. It was, by definition, a public event observed by the community, governed by witnesses, and concluded with binding recognition of the result. This public aspect was essential, for law in Viking society derived not from abstract institutions, but from consensus, memory, and performance. A decision carried weight because it was witnessed and remembered. In this sense, the duel was both theater and tribunal. The combatants stood not only before each other, but also before their society, whose collective judgment would sanctify the outcome. The crowd was not passive. Its presence transformed the fight into a ritual of legitimacy. When one combatant fell or yielded, the verdict was not merely his opponent's sword, but the community's acceptance of fate as rendered through combat.